Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you had a good chance this week to engage with, to read the texts, and to get a feeling for, well, some strange ideas about the environment. So, getting right to it, if you're coming to this video with questions, it's probably been surprising to some of you who are expecting the authors to explicitly engage with or comment on the natural world. But you remember when I said it in the last lecture that the way in which the environment was conceived was very different because we as humans certainly hadn't mastered it, didn't experience it as something over which we had real control or dominion. These authors come from that point of view. Today, when we think about the environment, we think in the world in a way that brings about connotations about the natural world. There's a sense in which the environment is almost the same as saying nature. Now, nature itself is a word that has later connotations, especially in the Romantic period. We get the idea of nature emerging as something objective, something which is separate from creation. It's fundamentally a secular way of framing the natural world, rather than when we hear even in classical Latin references to de rerum natura, so on the nature of things. This type of nature meant the way a thing is, but nature as the environment is sort of a given in that framing. So the nature of nature is just that it is. But the cosmos, the created order as understood by Christian philosophers and theologians, is a very different thing because it's not just a given. It is in fact created. So we think of it, or it is thought of by these people, Luther, Aquinas, Augustine, very differently. So what we got were actually three texts that discussed dominion. All three of them mentioned this explicitly in light of the creation account in Genesis, and to a certain extent in Aquinas, our connection between dominion and the types of roles given to humans related to their function on earth. Now, Aquinas speaks about the world as created, saying, quote, "All parts are ordered to the perfection of the whole, since the whole does not exist for the sake of its parts." End quote. We are, in fact, a part of that. So the world, in a certain sense, doesn't just exist for us. We also get, especially in the writings of Augustine and Luther, specific reference to human sexes, which, as I mentioned, seems like a strange tangent to take when discussing the environment, our environment. But as mentioned in the last video, the reason this was important for classical authors was that the human species was created for relationship, for relation, and this mimics the relational nature of the Trinity. And to some extent, this relational model is at the heart of human existence, which extends to how we relate to the world. So humans are themselves sexed. This requires a type of relationship in order to continue to exist. And in an analogical way, there's a relationship in between humanity and the rest of the created order. We need each other to exist. Now, to offer a criticism of these pieces, we're going to need to think about dominion specifically and use language that's been developed by other Christian thinkers, later Christian philosophers. So I'm going to try to break down some of the ways that dominion is understood, especially as it relates to the concept of power. Bear with me. You might want to even take some notes for this. Write down some terms. These are not ones that you necessarily find in Gill, but they're important frames of reference when discussing power, which is obviously a significant part of how we can do good or do evil. I'm going to turn specifically to the classifications of power that are used by Christine Fire. Oh, let me get this name right. One moment. Christine Führer-Hinze, in her book Comprehending Power in Christian Social Ethics. She's not the only person that uses these categories. They're often used by political scientists or political theorists, but this does give an excellent account of some of the different ways that ethicists explicitly think about power in a less monolithic sense. So here we go. In considering dominion, it's obvious that the etymological roots of this come from the Latin word dominus, which means Lord. And so to have dominion over something really has two aspects. There's obviously authority. This is what is granted to humans receiving dominion over the world in the biblical text. So the command to have dominion and subdue it. And that's a two-part thing, because ultimately authority is meaningless if it's merely observation, if nothing is done. Now, it's the type of actions that we take, or the type of behaviors we perform that in fact then go into what makes us exert dominion, good, well, or poorly. And without understanding some of the ways in which we can exert power and some of the nuances that are buried within ideas of dominion, could lead to the danger of oversimplifying what power is and then throwing out these texts and saying they're useless. They say nothing about our relationship to the world today, because if Aquinas, Augustine, and Luther don't understand the environment as something that we humans actually do have mastery over, it's difficult to gain anything from their insights, because their perspective and ours are so greatly removed from each other. Now, to say why I don't think that's the case, first we're going to understand the word agency. Not like agent as in a secret agent, but as someone who does something. If you've taken any type of philosophy courses in any of your other studies, it's a very good chance that you have encountered a type of discussion of what agency is and how it relates to the will. But here we go. Agency is the ability of a subject or of a thing, it doesn't necessarily mean a person, but a subject, to exert its will. So anything with a certain degree of potency. Sorry for all the jump cuts. I simply, I'm not trying to practice my video editing skills. I just have a son who likes jumping in on all this, but I digress. On the subject of agency, an agent is someone or something that can bring about an effect. Now, furthermore, agency breaks down into either personal agency or impersonal agency. And now we're starting to get somewhere that looks more like power as we understand it. But in terms of impersonal agency, just to refer to it and then leave it be, it's obvious that a tornado can affect change. But this is impersonal. No tornado actively wills that it hits a certain house when it touches down in Kansas. Now, personal agency or subjective agency is the ability of that subject to purposefully direct its will and then bring about a desired effect. One more time, personal agency is the ability of a subject to purposefully direct its will and then bring about a desired effect. That's the kind of agency that we care about and that we're going to be discussing when we talk about power. Now, I know tornadoes obviously are powerful natural phenomenon, but their power doesn't come attached with any type of authority. So when we want to talk about dominion, it's obviously the personal agency and that type of power that matters. So when I say agency, that's just going to be shorthand for personal agency unless I say otherwise. And in referring to humans, our human agency is our ability to bring about that desired cause through a rational act of will. We think things. there are different levels of agency usually attached to, there are different types of agency in classical understandings, for example, in Aquinas, that are tied to different types of souls that things might have. So plants have a vegetative soul, and they have a limited amount of agency associated with the vegetative functions of a living thing. Animals have appetites, and so they can do things like feed themselves, move themselves around to get to food or water or to avoid conflict. Humans, though, we have this type of real distinct agency because we can think things and then project our desires or our will into the future and then move towards that if our agency is proving to be effective. Now, from there, it's not hard to see how being given authority and possessing the ability to actually do something starts to sound like power, maybe even legitimate power, because we have authority. But it's here that Ferenczi and others make distinctions about the types of power. If you are an engaged political science wonk, you might be able to go deeper than just these three basic ones, but I want to discuss three types of power. Now, these are having power over something, first of all, power to do something, and then thirdly, power with. So we have power over, power to, and power with. Power over something is the one that perhaps most naturally aligns with the idea of dominion, because power over is a relational framing that's hierarchical. So to have power over something means that you can make it do what you want it to do. I have power over my car when I push my foot down on the accelerator. I have power even over my wallet. Power over is a relationship, and so you might have power and you might be very powerful, but without another thing, without another person or object, something else needs to be there for you to exert your power over to have that kind of power. You don't really have power over nothing. Now, what you may have is power to do something, so power to, because that type of power is understood as being dispositional. So power over is relational with a hierarchical component. Power to is dispositional. Oftentimes, if you read scholastic accounts of human activity, this is described as potency. So I have the power to change my mind. And that doesn't mean necessarily that I am doing, but it is one of my capabilities. It is a disposition I possess in and of myself, just me. I don't need to have another person around for me to do this for myself. I can change my own mind. Whether or not I do is a separate matter, but understand that I at least possess that kind of power. You do too. If you're willing to change your mind about how you thought about power, more power to you. Now, that gets to the third type of power, which is the idea of power with. Now, to transition from power to power with, I want you to see the difference when you consider how you might go about affecting change in someone else's thoughts or actions. Perhaps it's easy to see how I, as someone currently teaching, would want to do that. I have a dispositional, I hope that I possess the dispositional power to teach, power to educate. If I have power over someone, though, say power over my son who was just coming in, I can make him eat his broccoli. Whether that takes sweet talk or threats of punishment or that dagger stare that most parents seem to possess that I'm still working on. I don't have that. But that type of enforcing my will usually leads to my son going, he eats the broccoli. But he doesn't really want it, let's say. Now, I also have the power to make my son want to eat his broccoli. And this is different. So that power to try and change him means that I can, as a personal agent, desire something, faced with a set of choices about how to enact my will. I decide not to enforce it or assert myself, but I bring about the change in the thing or the person I am in relation with without a direct imposition. It's not direct. When I try to change his mind, I am aware that my son is an end unto himself. So if I know the benefits of eating broccoli, it is in my power, or I hope it is in my power, to teach him about those benefits with the aim of changing his mind. Now, maybe the benefit of eating broccoli tonight is just that he gets to have dessert. But that still is something that I have the power to change his mind on. That disposition is not a brute assertion, but rather a way of trying to share my disposition with another while respecting their autonomy. But in that model, having power to do something still puts the onus on me. I am the one who possesses the power in toto, in full. Power with is a type of relational power. It's not hierarchical in the same way that power over is. But power with requires that a relationship be cooperative, because the power or the potency of that type of power is only made possible through the relationship. So I have power with, consider this something like signing authority on a check. Some of you might have worked for a nonprofit in the past, where as a type of fraud prevention mechanism, there is a requirement of 2 signatures. So you don't really possess the power to give someone money, but you have power with a co-signer to issue that money to a given person. That type of relationship, that power that only comes in coordination or in cooperation with another party, is a third kind of power. So with that in mind, hopefully now you understand these 3 ways of thinking about enforcing or using your will. You can have power over things, and let's just put the word in. You can have power over nature. You have power to do X, Y, Z in nature or with nature. And you, or humanity, also has power with nature. So there are some ways in which our actions actually are only enabled, they're only made possible through cooperating with nature. Now, all of that obviously isn't hidden in the concept of dominion. But I mention all 3 of them because I think it is important to see how pulling apart the power that is at the heart of dominion, to demonstrate how it is not simply a bully verse. This is not something that can be set up, as it was set up by Lynn White, to be something which inextricably ties the Christian tradition with this baggage of a particular relationship with the environment. So if you read dominion in the Genesis account, or if you read dominion in Aquinas and Luther as being simply authority plus power over, then you will fundamentally misread the relationship, not only that is possible, but that was understood to exist throughout much of the Christian tradition vis-a-vis our relationship to the natural world. There are obviously ways in which power over is important, literally beating back the bushes, the vines that want to creep in and encroach, eventually consume civilization. This is a real thing, simply as a tangible way of discussing this. I remember my mother 15, 20 years ago was working with the YMCA, and she went to Belize. In Belize, the YMCA there had actually been given a gigantic mansion that had been seized by the federal government there, sort of related to drug crime, in the way that, in Canada and the United States, there's civil forfeiture. So profits from the proceeds of crime, once those crimes have been identified and you've been convicted of them, those proceeds are able to be seized by the government because, ill-gotten gains and whatnot. But sometimes the question arises, what do you do with these things? You can't get rid of everything at the police auction. And so in Belize, this gigantic drug lord's mansion had been given to the YMCA. But they didn't know what to do with it. And over time, as they hummed and hawed about what to do with this fantastic mansion, they just left it there in the jungle. And within 4 years, it was completely overrun. There were animals living in all of the rooms, but also the vegetation had encroached so that there actually were vines creeping up not only the inside of the building, but up the staircases inside. Nests that had been planted by birds and bats had brought in small seeds and dirt, leaves even, so that there was a thin layer of earth and sort of wet compost on the ground. And this fantastic testament to wealth and opulence and criminal activity was actually being consumed by the natural world around it. That is a real thing. And if you consider the act of groundskeeping or the act of gardening in a pre-modern society where we don't have asphalt barriers and concrete walls dividing communities from the outside world, that very act of beating back the encroaching natural world to keep these pockets of civilization alive, that is a real, and I would say good and justified human activity. So that type of power over nature, to push back at it, seems to be almost a common sense necessity for human life as we understand it. So power over is obviously not fully without its merits, but the instrumentalization of the world completely, not just that it's an inconvenience to human communities, but represents a type of neutral storehouse of environmental wealth that we have power over, flips the script completely. Now, that secondary development, the idea of seeing nature as a value neutral terrain which is open and ripe for human exploitation, that happens much later than any of these authors are writing in. That type of change, the instrumentalization of nature, is in fact roughly correspondent with perhaps you could say the Industrial Revolution, but really, even at that time, nature was still the world. Nature was still the created order. And it is especially and explicitly when we arrive at the concept of nature as such. So no longer the environment, no longer the created world, not only God's green earth, but instead what we have is nature. This changes things. So I'd say roughly around the Romantic period is where this happens. It would be difficult for me to pin down a particular author that makes this case, but for an excellent example of just how the idea of nature functions, if this is the kind of thing that interests you, I consider the work of Timothy Morton, who is one of the leading proponents of a school of philosophy referred to object-oriented ontology, and especially in this field of object-oriented ontology, they discuss nature as being a hyper-object. So it is just a thing, or it is conceived of as a thing, but it's a thing that is spread out through time and space, that is both impossible to pin down and infinitely divisible. It's a fascinating way of trying to understand from a non-theistic perspective just what we mean when we say the natural world, and how that allows us to exploit it. So Timothy Morton, his book Hyperobjects, or anyone else who might be associated with object-oriented ontology, just as an aside. But all this to say that when we have power over something, and that something is still God's good creation, there is a hesitancy when it comes to treating that created order as just a means. It still is an end. As I was saying in the last session, there is a very explicit way in the pre-modern era where the created order, where the natural world is still seen to be in relation with God, wholly apart from any connection to man. So God has a relationship with the created order. God has a relationship with humanity. Humanity has a relationship with the rest of the natural world, and that this division of relationships was understood in a much more rich sense. So a tree was not just lumber waiting to happen, but was something that demonstrated God's creative abilities. And not just trees, there was this whole idea that all of nature was pregnant with symbolism and stories that in fact represented to the world a Christian worldview. Probably the only way this would be familiar to any to you is if you're familiar with the Carol of the Holly that is played every year at Christmas time. So I'm not even going to try to sing it for you, but the holly and the ivy, which goes, the holly bears a blossom as white as the lily flower, and Mary bore sweet Jesus Christ to be our sweet Savior. The holly bears a berry as red as any blood, and Mary bore sweet Jesus Christ to do us sinners good. So in these objects in the natural world, there are actually stories told. They're almost mythological representations of the Christian life. There's if you ever want to go down an interesting rabbit hole of medieval art, I just encourage you to look up medieval bestiaries, especially medieval bestiaries and pelicans, which were seen to, pelicans for the medievals were actually single animals that told the story of Christ's death and resurrection. The idea was that at some point, a pelican, a mother pelican, gave birth to chicks. They grew up, and those very chicks then became aggressive towards their mother, even after the mother had cared for them. So that the chicks actually try to kill the mother. So in anger, she retaliates them and kills her own children. But after 3 days, the pelican regrets her actions, pierces her own side with her beak. And so she allows her blood to drip onto her children. They come back to life, and she, the mother pelican, dies, having made this ultimate sacrifice for her children. I mean, that story would have been as attached to the idea of pelicans as we would attach saying, "Who's a good boy?" To the idea of dog. Of course, that's a dog. Nobody says, "Who's a good boy?" to their pet pot-bellied pig or anything else. There were ideas associated with every aspect of the natural world that retold and represented the story of the Christian life. So that way of thinking about the natural world obviously mitigates against a type of exploitation that we would associate with the value neutral nature over which we have power. So that is why dominion very often includes these other types of power, including power to. We, as humans, in exercising our dominion, have our power to coax plants from the ground, have the power to set up, even something as simple as sow seeds in the air and then hope that something arises. We have the power to move water in order to run mills with the belief that the water might dry up, the rains might not come. So we might hope for something, but we would never get angry at the river for drying up if the rains ceased to fall, because we would never assume that we ever had full power over that river. And finally, dominion in terms of power with is a way of thinking about just what the natural world can provide for us. In fact, we don't have the power to, think of it this way, we don't have power to build cities in ourselves. We might have power with stone, with wood, with brick and mortar and clay. We have power with those things to create, but it's not simply a product of human ingenuity that these come into existence. And so power with is something that we are enabled to do only with the assistance of the natural world, to which we should be grateful. If you're feeling sensitive, this might sound like it has some significant resonances with many forms of indigenous spirituality and ways of being in the world. That everything that we receive from the natural world is in fact received as a gift, which we then respect, and in doing the activity that makes us human, in hunting and fishing and writing books, in building houses, in celebrating successes, mourning death, in these activities, the objects that we require to do these things only come to us. They only exist. That type of power with insists that we can only do what we do with the cooperation of, in this case, the natural world. And that type of respect and admission of our own impartial ability is another way of thinking about power that still is totally consonant, makes total sense in a framework that uses language of dominion. So we might have authority. However, our power really only comes, our power to do things only comes into existence in our power with the natural world. It gives us gifts, and if perhaps there's some moments of antagonism because we might be interlopers in a particular part of the natural world, we may need to exercise power over that thing. This is a common truism that I use whether I'm talking to people, whether I'm talking to people over a beer, whether I'm talking to people over a pulpit, whether I'm talking to people in a hospital or at a music festival. There is very often in any discussion of Christianity, especially amongst believers, but also amongst those who have negative experiences, that moment where someone says something, you can't play God, or you're just trying to play God. And there's an idea in that we humans should not presume to try to take on the mantle, the role of the Lord. But the role of the Dominus, the role of God, has in some small way, if we take Genesis seriously, been given to us. We do have this dominion. And so the question is not whether or not we can play God. Because obviously we are. We are doing these types of things, making world-changing decisions, both on the human scale and the environmental scale. So of course, we already are playing God. The difference is, it is up to us to determine whether or not we do that well or poorly. And that gets to, I think, just why considering dominion seriously is a responsible act of being human. We need to admit that our own agency, our own power, is tremendous and growing at an exponential rate. And so in light of that, and echoing the language of dominion that we've found in these texts, and understanding that if we take humanity as sort of a relational archetype, and we are therefore in relation with the world, we can and are being asked to play the role of God, even if it's just as a stand-in. We have been given dominion. The difference is our lordship, our dominion, can be done poorly, can be an abysmal failure. And it behooves us to consider how we can do better, especially in relation to the natural world. And so as we look at people grappling with contemporary crises in our next section next week, keep in mind that it is always an abdication of our given responsibility to say that we ought to not try to play God. We've been doing it. We've just been screwing it up.
I need to